this guy named George Williams became the main guy. Now, who was George Williams?
You want to know about Georgie? His name came up in a lot of murders.
He had to lay low.
He moved in silence.
Yeah.
They called him Death Row's shadow, the quiet enforcer who made killers nervous. To the Compton gang unit, he wasn't just another street name. He was a ghost with a trigger. Officer Robert Ladd called him a straight killer, the real deal, while Reggie Wright Jr. described him as Death Row's #1 gangster.
George Williams was a mob pyro, and the guy was a hitman. He's a straight killer. He was the real deal.
He wasn't a rapper. He was the muscle that kept the empire alive. But when loyalty turned to betrayal and his own boss marked him for death, he didn't just survive. He came back to hunt the men who created him.
How was he able to go up against those guys and come out victorious like that? How was one man able to go against that many people?
Now, let's rewind to the very beginning. Born in Compton, California, in 1965, George G. Williams grew up during a time when the city was shifting from quiet neighborhoods to a center of gang politics. The Looters Park Piru set, known as the mother set of all Pirus in Compton, was forming on the east side. Crip sets had begun spreading across Los Angeles in the early 1970s, and young men in Compton's neighborhoods organized the Pirus as a way to fight back and protect themselves. George's childhood was shaped by that environment. He came from a working-class family and was considered a smart student in school, but like many teenagers at the time, he was surrounded by gang activity. Older members from the block introduced him to the realities of street protection, retaliation, and reputation. What started as neighborhood unity quickly became a survival code. By the time he was a teenager, Compton was one of the most dangerous areas in Los Angeles County. Violent crime was rising sharply, with drive-bys, territorial disputes, and robberies happening daily. The Looters Park Pirus became known for being especially organized and loyal to each other, often handling their disputes internally before taking them outside. George found his place within that structure. He was quiet, observant, and rarely drew unnecessary attention to himself, but those who knew him noticed his ability to stay calm under pressure. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, as crack flooded Los Angeles, the lines between gang life and business blurred. For George, the transition from small-time neighborhood disputes to large-scale street activity was natural. The Piru name began to carry weight, and George became one of the individuals whose actions reinforced that reputation.
This guy named George Williams became the main guy. Now, who was George Williams?
George Williams was a mob pyro.
He wasn't known for being loud or flashy, but rather for being methodical. Within the Looters Park set, that made him stand out. While others sought recognition through chaos, George earned his through control and precision. He became the type of person people called when something needed to be handled quietly and effectively. By the mid to late 1980s, his name had become associated with enforcement, the kind of work that required discipline, not emotion. As Suge Knight began making his mark in the music business, he naturally drew from the same environment George came from. Suge was raised not far from Looters Park territory and understood the influence those men had in Compton. By the early 1990s, the two worlds, music and the streets, began to merge. When Death Row Records started building its empire, Suge surrounded himself with people he trusted from the neighborhood, and eventually these people made Suge what he became.
We brung a lot to Suge that a lot of people don't know. We gave Suge what he is. And with that, a lot of people in the industry was so afraid of Suge.
He wanted protection, presence, and credibility, and the Pirus provided all three. Among them, George Williams' reputation made him a natural choice. He was not just another name from the set. He was someone both the streets and law enforcement recognized. Before he ever stepped into the music world, George had already built a reputation that commanded caution. Police officers in Compton knew who he was. Some described him as the real deal, a man whose influence didn't come from celebrity or wealth, but from respect earned through consistent action.
And the guy was a hitman. He's a straight killer. He was the real deal.
By the time Suge Knight came calling in 1993, George had already proven himself many times over. The world that raised him, the alliances, the rivalries, and the constant cycle of retaliation had prepared him for what was to come. What began as survival in Compton's roughest blocks would soon evolve into a role inside one of the most feared empires in music history. And for George G. Williams, Death Row Records would be the place where his reputation reached its most dangerous peak and where loyalty would turn into his deadliest lesson. By the early 90s, Compton had already hardened George Williams into a man who understood two things: power and silence. He didn't move like the young bangers flashing colors for reputation. He moved with purpose. Word on the street was that he could walk into the middle of a fight, say nothing, and everyone would listen. That quiet authority was what eventually caught Suge Knight's attention. At that time, Suge was building something bigger than a record label, a fortress. Death Row wasn't just music. It was muscle, loyalty, and intimidation wrapped in platinum chains. And for that empire to stand, he needed soldiers who were feared enough to keep order when the cameras stopped rolling. George Williams was exactly that.
These gangbangers is gonna come blow my house up, or they finna this, and I can't be seen on the music scene no more. I can't be caught at the studio. People paid Suge to be around Suge.
Right.
Before he ever set foot in Death Row's offices, George had already earned respect across the Pyru sets of Compton, most notably among the Mob Pyrus and Looters Park Pyrus. He wasn't known for being flashy or reckless, but for being dependable. If George said he'd handle something, it was done. And in a world where word was everything, that made him valuable. When Suge started merging street politics with the business of rap, men like George became critical. He wasn't hired for security, he was brought in for control. Reggie Wright Jr., who later ran Death Row's internal security, once said George was the one guy you didn't have to tell twice. According to those who worked around the label, he became Suge's shadow, always nearby, rarely speaking, but never out of reach. Behind the scenes, Death Row's image of power was partly an illusion. The label ran on a fine balance between fame and fear. Whenever tensions rose between artists, rival crews, or business partners, George was the one who restored order, not through words, but through presence. By 1995, Death Row had become the most feared label in the country. Tupac had joined the camp, Dre was drifting out, and Suge was tightening his circle. Inside that circle stood George, a man with no press, no interviews, and no songs to his name, yet every man in the building knew not to cross him. He was part bodyguard, part enforcer, part peacekeeper. Some said he carried himself more like a detective than a gang member, calm, observant, deliberate. But to those who crossed the line, that calm was the last thing they saw before things got violent. For Suge, George wasn't just protection, he was insurance. But power never stays balanced for long, because in a world built on fear and loyalty, all it takes is one moment, one order for the shadow to realize it's being used. But tension inside Death Row was no longer about money or respect, it was survival. The same power structure G once enforced was starting to turn on itself, and soon, he would find his own name on the list. By 1996, cracks were already forming inside Death Row. The label's violent reputation had begun to draw unwanted attention from both the LAPD and federal agents. Internal suspicion grew as money started disappearing, alliances shifted, and loyalty became harder to measure. Inside that pressure, Suge Knight's circle began to tighten even further, and George Williams, once his most trusted enforcer, found himself on the wrong side of that line. Accounts from former insiders suggest that Suge's paranoia had reached a peak after the Las Vegas shooting that killed Tupac Shakur. Law enforcement was closing in, and the label's hierarchy was under scrutiny. George, who had been part of the inner enforcement structure, became a target of that mistrust. He was accused of leaking information and of growing too independent. What began as silence turned into distance. George started operating without full access to Suge's movements, and certain members of the security team stopped acknowledging him. Reggie Wright Jr., who was still connected to Death Row's operations, later confirmed that Suge believed someone close to him was working with law enforcement. Within weeks, George's name came up in conversations he wasn't meant to hear. The first real sign of betrayal came when George was ordered to attend a late-night meeting in Compton. He arrived and noticed the setup of multiple cars, unfamiliar faces, and a tense silence. Street instinct told him this wasn't business. He backed out before anything happened, and within hours, word spread that he had been marked for elimination. To the people who knew him, this moment marked the end of George's loyalty to Suge. The man who had once taken bullets for the label now realized the same organization could turn on him without hesitation. Law enforcement records from the period show that shortly after this fallout, George went off the grid. He stopped showing up at death row events, cut off communication with known associates, and reportedly began collecting information on those who had turned against him. According to retired detectives who tracked the label's criminal activity, George wasn't hiding, he was preparing. For the next several months, shootings linked to Compton gangs and death row affiliates began to increase. None were officially tied to George, but whispers in the community suggested he was behind several retaliatory attacks. Officers like Robert Ladd later said it was hard to prove anything because, when George moved, bodies dropped, but no one talked. By 1997, Suge Knight was back in prison on a parole violation, and death row was collapsing from the inside. George had already distanced himself completely. The trust, the money, and the silence that once held everything together were gone. Mob James later recalled how Suge's downfall came with a wave of bitterness. He went to jail and stripped everything away, even the cars, refusing to let anyone else drive them. What had once been loyalty now felt like abandonment.
When Suge went to jail, Suge took back everything. He didn't want nobody to drive. He didn't want nobody to live.
So all the cars were basically leased under death row?
Yeah.
And then when he went to jail, he took everyone's cars
Park
back.
'em.
That betrayal turned death row's most trusted enforcer into its most dangerous opponent. And as the empire that once ruled the West Coast began to crumble, George started quietly taking apart what was left, not out of rage, but out of survival. He understood the game better than anyone. When power fades, the smartest move is to disappear before the system finishes what betrayal started. When Suge Knight's empire began to fracture, George Williams no longer operated as an enforcer. He was moving independently, guided by method and memory. Every move he made after the betrayal seemed aimed at the same target, the inner structure that once defined death row's control over Compton. Law enforcement officers would later describe this period as a calculated dismantling of the label's muscle. After escaping the attempted hit, George aligned himself with Roderick Lil Rod Reed, a figure from Fruittown, Piru. Lil Rod had risen quickly in Compton's underworld, transforming his network into one of the largest PCP operations in Southern California. Unlike the mob Pirus, who mixed gang activity with record label business, Lil Rod's organization was built purely on profit and efficiency. He became the financial anchor behind George's quiet campaign. To George, this was both survival and balance, a shift in power away from Suge's circle and toward those he once underestimated. The first strike came with precision. On June 1st, 1997, Heron Palmer, the same man who had shot George during his torture, was caught idling at a stoplight in Compton. Witnesses described a two-person hit team stepping out of a nearby vehicle and opening fire with automatic rifles. 27 rounds tore through the car, killing Heron instantly. Detectives at the scene noted the planning. No random shooting, no warning. Whoever organized it knew Heron's route and timing. Word spread fast through Compton that George had quarterbacked the operation. One of the alleged shooters was rumored to be his girlfriend, Wozie, disguised as a man. Law enforcement later admitted that, until that moment, nobody ever had the nerve to take out anyone from Suge's inner circle.
So I wasn't able to go with him. And unfortunately, a few hours later, I get a call from Whack Deuce. He's like, man, Heron just got killed. And I was like, I was shocked, bro. You know, I was shocked.
For a while, things went quiet. George and Lil Rod stayed under the radar, focusing on business and maintaining control over their network. But by 2000, a major robbery reignited the conflict. A large amount of Lil Rod's PCP supply disappeared, and investigations pointed to men associated with Wardell Poochie Faust, one of Suge's favorite enforcers. On August 4th, 2000, a van carrying Poochie and his friend William was ambushed in Compton. The attackers fired repeatedly, killing William on the spot while Poochie barely survived. Detectives believe George was one of the shooters, though no charges were filed. The message was unmistakable. The retaliation was no longer isolated and was structured. That same year, a new event pushed tensions to their peak. Vincent Vogue Buchanan, known as Big V, was a close friend of Lil Rod. He was kidnapped, tortured, and later found dead near a Compton cemetery.
They had this boy named Vincent Buchanan, who was V-Dog. He got killed in Compton, tortured, dropped off, handcuffed, dropped off on Central in front of the cemetery.
The details surrounding his death were disturbing, but what came afterward made it worse. Rumors circulated that Buntry McDonald and David Brim Dave Dudley, both prominent members of Suge's Mob Piru faction, had obtained a videotape of Vogg's torture and played it casually in front of associates at Buntry's home. For George, it wasn't just disrespect, it was an open act of mockery. Within months, another killing followed. On March 25th, 2001, Brim Dave was shot multiple times outside Buntry's residence. Witnesses reported seeing a man step out of a dark vehicle and fire before calmly walking back to the car. Police found no physical evidence, but the attack carried the same cold precision as the earlier hits. Law enforcement and former insiders later identified George as the prime suspect. By that point, the pattern was clear. Each target, Heron, William, Brim Dave, had been tied directly to the circle that once protected Suge Knight. Each killing stripped another layer of security away from the old death row infrastructure. What had begun as personal retaliation was now a full-scale purge. For Compton investigators, the violence of those years didn't resemble random gang warfare. It looked deliberate and methodical. The same calm and calculation that once made George valuable to death row had now turned against it. As one detective later put it, he didn't just disappear, he started cleaning house. By the end of 2001, death row's grip on the streets was gone. The mob Pirus, once seen as untouchable, moved cautiously through their own neighborhoods. George Williams, the quiet enforcer who had once been part of Suge's inner defense, had systematically dismantled it, one name at a time. By 2002, the streets of Compton were suffocating under a quiet but deadly purge. Every few months, another familiar face from death row's inner circle was either gunned down or vanished without a trace. At the center of it all stood George Ponytail Williams and Roderick Lil Rod Reed, whose alliance had turned into a ruthless campaign of vengeance. Their mission was clear: dismantle every piece of Suge Knight's protection structure, one name at a time. The final and most symbolic target was Alton Buntry McDonald. To anyone who understood death row's hierarchy, Buntry wasn't just another soldier. He was the boss's shadow. He had grown up in the same Piru neighborhood as Suge and remained his right-hand man even after Suge went to prison. In the eyes of the Mo Piru set, Buntry was untouchable. He handled the label's street operations, enforced discipline, and ensured that no one disrespected the name Knight. For years, his loyalty made him both respected and feared across Compton, but that same loyalty became a death sentence. When word spread that Buntry and Brim Dave had allegedly played a videotape showing the torture and murder of Lil Rod's friend Vincent Vogg Buchanan, it crossed a line George couldn't ignore. In the world they lived in, humiliation carried a heavier price than money or territory. The tape became the final trigger. On April 3rd, 2002, Buntry pulled his black Cadillac into a gas station on Rosecrans Avenue in Compton, a route he'd taken countless times before. He was alone, refueling, unaware that he'd been marked. Two men approached his car on foot and opened fire, hitting him 4 times in the chest. Buntry collapsed beside the pump, dead before paramedics arrived.
Buntry was shot. And when Buntry was shot, somebody that was with Buntry had called and told them where Buntry was at. Now there's an armed-fledged war between each other in death row.
Witnesses recalled seeing the shooters flee in a pickup truck driven by a man with a ponytail, a description that matched George Williams almost exactly. The precision of the attack suggested inside knowledge. It wasn't random, it was surgical. The killing sent shockwaves through Compton's underworld. Buntry's death wasn't just a personal loss to Suge Knight. It was a symbolic execution of his authority. For years, Buntry had acted as a bridge between Suge's empire and the streets that powered it. With him gone, that bridge was broken. Many within the Piru network began retreating, unsure who would be next. The violence didn't stop there. Just 6 months later, another close associate of Suge, a man known as Hog, was ambushed and killed on October 16th, 2002, near a fried chicken stand. Hogg wasn't a gang enforcer. He was an artist who designed the original Death Row Records logo, but his proximity to Suge made him a target. Investigators quietly linked the killing to the same revenge campaign that had claimed Buntry's life. Then came the final blow. On July 24th, 2003, Wardell Poochie Faust, one of the last men still loyal to Suge, was shot 10 times in the back while riding his motorcycle through Compton. Poochie had survived an earlier assassination attempt 3 years prior, but this time, there was no escape. Law enforcement later theorized that G and Lil Rod had orchestrated the hit as part of the continuing effort to erase Suge's remaining enforcers. By the end of 2003, the once feared death row street network had collapsed. Nearly every major figure connected to Suge's Piru security structure was either dead or underground. What had started as a personal vendetta had transformed into a total dismantling of one of Los Angeles' most notorious street alliances. And as James Mobb would say, Suge started recruiting little homies.
They used him to get Buntry out the house. They stopped at a gas station. Nick pulled up, killed my brother.
George Williams disappeared soon after. Some claimed he fled California. Others whispered he was still in Compton, moving in silence. But one thing was certain: the shadow that once protected death row had turned on its own, leaving behind a trail of silence where power once ruled. By 2003, Compton was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that came after a storm. The streets that once echoed with gunfire and loyalty to death row were now ruled by whispers. Nearly every major figure connected to Suge Knight's Piru network was gone, and the empire that once moved like a machine had crumbled into fear and paranoia. But George "Ponytail" Williams wasn't celebrating. While Suge's organization was collapsing under street pressure, G was building something else, an empire of his own. The next war wouldn't be fought with bullets. It would be fought with chemicals. Alongside Roderick "Lil Rod" Reed, G shifted focus from street warfare to the drug trade. Both men had learned from years of watching how power and money flowed through Compton. This time, instead of enforcing someone else's vision, they created their own. They moved out of the crowded city streets into the more remote stretches of California's Inland Empire, where law enforcement surveillance was weaker. There, they set up large-scale PCP labs operations that federal agents would later describe as some of the most advanced ever seen in Southern California. For nearly 2 years, the duo operated quietly, generating millions of dollars and maintaining strict discipline. G was methodical, no unnecessary movement, no outsiders. Every batch was measured, every shipment tracked. But while he had mastered control over the streets, he couldn't outrun federal eyes forever. In late 2003, the silence broke. Acting on months of surveillance and wiretaps, federal drug agents launched a coordinated raid across multiple properties connected to G and Lil Rod. The results were staggering: 175 kilograms of PCP, over 50 firearms, and $175,000 in cash. Agents found full-scale labs, complete with ventilation systems, chemical stockpiles, and distribution maps. The DEA called it one of the largest PCP operations ever dismantled in the region. For George Williams, it wasn't an arrest. It was the end of an era. The same precision he used in the streets had drawn the attention of an entirely different enemy: the federal government. In 2005, G and Lil Rod were convicted on multiple counts of manufacturing and distributing PCP, along with conspiracy to distribute. Both faced maximum life sentences. In court, prosecutors framed them not just as drug dealers, but as remnants of the same violent machinery that once powered death row records. The trial made quiet headlines, but sent a loud message. The last of Suge's real enforcers was officially gone. Compton Gang Unit investigator Fred Reynolds later reflected on the aftermath. When that many people close to Suge got killed, it wasn't coincidence. George dismantled what was left of his structure. What bullets didn't finish, the federal system did. By the mid-2000s, death row was a name from another lifetime. Its leadership fractured, its soldiers dead or in prison, and its reputation hollowed out. But the story didn't end behind bars. In 2021, nearly 2 decades after his conviction, reports surfaced that George Williams had quietly been released on parole. The man many called the ghost of death row was free again. But this time, there were no headlines, no photos, and no interviews. Reggie Wright Jr., a former death row insider, confirmed G's release, adding that he even received word through an associate: stop mentioning his name in public. The warning wasn't a threat, it was a reminder that G still commanded silent respect. Even Mob James, the brother of the slain Buntry McDonald, admitted that when he heard G was out, He wanted no contact. "I don't want to see him," he said plainly. After everything that had unfolded, George didn't need to speak for his reputation to carry weight. Today, G's name exists more as a whisper than a memory. To some, he's a myth. To others, a cautionary tale. He never sought fame, never gave interviews, and never claimed his own story. He simply disappeared back into the shadows, the same way he had once appeared, silently, methodically, and without warning. George Williams' life wasn't just about violence or revenge. It was about how far loyalty can bend before it breaks, and how the same discipline that builds an empire can also destroy it. In the end, he lived and moved like what people always called him, a ghost. And even now, long after the empire he protected is gone, that ghost still walks.